Quilts keep us warmer when we reach the cabin, but we must keep moving to stay ahead of the storm.
The stranger at the door. The winter of 1873 came early to the Montana Territory, sweeping down from the Canadian Rockies like a hungry wolf, all teeth and bitter cold. Jacob Thornewood had lived alone in his timber cabin for 6 years now, ever since his younger brother died of fever and left him with nothing but silence and the endless work of felling trees. At 32 years old, Jacob had grown accustomed to the solitude, to the way his own breath sounded too loud in the stillness, to eating meals without conversation, to lying awake at night with only the wind for company. His hands were calloused and strong, his shoulders broad from swinging the axe day after day, but his heart had grown small and tight, like a fist that had forgotten how to open. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, a half-day's ride from the nearest settlement of Copper Falls. Jacob preferred it that way. People asked questions. People expected things. Out here, the only expectations were survival and the next cord of wood. He sold timber to the mining operations and the growing towns, made enough to get by, and that was all he figured he needed. The loneliness had become like an old coat, worn and familiar, something he hardly noticed anymore except on the coldest nights when the wolves howled, and he remembered what it felt like to hear another human voice answer back. It was on such a night, with snow falling thick as wool and the temperature dropping so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows, that Jacob heard the knocking. At first, he thought it was a branch hitting the side of the cabin, or perhaps his mind playing tricks. But then it came again, desperate and rhythmic, the kind of knocking that spoke of urgency and fear. He grabbed his rifle out of habit, though he couldn't imagine who would be out in this weather, and pulled open the heavy wooden door. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. A woman stood on his porch, so thin she looked like she might blow away in the wind, her face pale as the snow except for two bright spots of red on her cheeks that spoke of fever or frostbite or both. She wore a threadbare coat that had probably been fine once, but was now patched and worn through in places, and behind her, clinging to her skirts like frightened animals, were 3 children. The oldest couldn't have been more than 8, a girl with dark hair and eyes too old for her face. Next to her stood a boy of maybe 6, and in the woman's arms, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days, was a baby, barely visible except for one tiny hand that had escaped the folds of cloth. "Please," the woman said, and her voice was barely a whisper, cracked and desperate. "Please, we have nowhere else to go. Our wagon broke down 5 miles back. My husband," she faltered, and Jacob saw tears freeze on her cheeks almost as soon as they fell. "My husband died 2 days ago. Pneumonia. We've been walking since yesterday morning. The children, they can't make it any further."
Jacob stood there, frozen not by the cold but by the shock of it, by the sudden intrusion of desperate humanity into his carefully ordered solitude. Every instinct told him to help, but another part of him, the part that had built walls around his heart for 6 long years, wanted to close the door, to send them to Copper Falls where there were proper families and churches and people who knew how to care for the broken and the lost. He wasn't equipped for this. He didn't know anything about children or widows or how to comfort the grieving. He was just a woodsman, a man who understood trees and axes and the simple mathematics of survival. But then the little girl looked up at him, and her eyes held such hope and such fear tangled together that something inside him shifted, like ice breaking on a river in spring. The baby made a small sound, a weak cry that spoke of hunger and cold, and the boy swayed on his feet, clearly at the end of his strength. "Come in," Jacob heard himself say, stepping back and opening the door wider. "Quickly now, before you freeze to death on my porch." The woman nearly collapsed with relief, stumbling forward into the warmth of the cabin. Jacob caught her elbow, steadying her, and was shocked by how light she was, how fragile. The children followed, moving like small ghosts, their eyes wide and watchful. Jacob closed the door against the storm and turned to face them, suddenly aware of how small his cabin was, how unprepared he was for this moment. He had one bed, one chair, one of everything, because one was all he'd ever needed. "Sit by the fire," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "All of you. I'll get some food heated up." The woman sank into his chair, still holding the baby, and the 2 older children pressed close to her sides. Jacob moved to the stove, his hands working automatically, putting a pot of venison stew on to warm, slicing bread, pouring water into cups. His mind was racing. What was he supposed to do with them? He couldn't send them back out into the storm, that much was certain. But after that? How long would they stay? What did they need? What did he have to offer? "My name is Sarah," the woman said quietly from behind him. "Sarah Cooper. This is my daughter Emma, my son Thomas, and the baby is called Lily. We were headed to my sister's place in Oregon Territory. My husband heard there was good farmland there, a chance to start over. We sold everything we had back in Kansas to make the journey." Jacob turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time. Beneath the exhaustion and the fever-bright eyes, he could see that she had once been pretty, perhaps even beautiful. She had the kind of face that spoke of kindness and determination, the kind of woman who would have been the backbone of some small farming community, raising children and keeping a home and making a life out of hard soil and harder circumstances. Now she looked like a candle burning at both ends, the flame guttering but not quite out. "I'm Jacob Thornewood," he said. "You can stay here until the storm passes. Then we'll figure out what comes next." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again. "God bless you, Mr. Thornewood. I don't know how to thank you. We have a little money, not much, but—" "We'll talk about that later," Jacob interrupted, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Right now, let's get some food in these children and get everyone warm and dry." The hours that followed were strange and awkward. Jacob found himself doing things he hadn't done in years, speaking softly to children, helping Emma and Thomas remove their wet boots, ladling stew into bowls and watching to make sure they ate slowly so they wouldn't make themselves sick. Sarah tried to help, but it was clear she was running on nothing but willpower, and when Jacob finally convinced her to lie down on his bed with the baby, she was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. Jacob made pallets on the floor near the fire for Emma and Thomas, giving them his spare blankets and his winter coat to cover them. They fell asleep quickly, exhausted beyond measure, and suddenly Jacob found himself alone in his cabin that was no longer alone, listening to the breathing of 4 other people, watching the firelight play across their sleeping faces. The storm howled outside, but inside, there was warmth and the sound of life, and Jacob felt something he hadn't felt in 6 years. He felt needed. He felt like maybe, just maybe, his life might mean something more than cords of wood and empty evenings. It terrified him more than the storm ever could. The days that followed. Morning came gray and cold, the storm still raging outside with no sign of letting up. Jacob woke from his place on the floor near the door, his back aching from the hard wood, and for a moment he thought perhaps he had dreamed it all. But then he heard the baby crying, a thin, hungry sound, and saw Sarah stirring on his bed, and he knew it was all too real. The children were still asleep by the fire, curled together like puppies in a den, and Jacob felt that strange tightness in his chest again, that feeling he couldn't quite name. Sarah sat up slowly, cradling Lily, and her eyes found Jacob's across the dim room. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I didn't mean to take your bed. You should have woken me." "You needed the rest," Jacob replied, standing and stretching, trying to work the kinks out of his spine. "Storm still going. Might be another day or 2 before it's safe to travel." Sarah's face fell. "We've already imposed on you too much. If you could just point us toward Copper Falls." "In this weather," Jacob shook his head. "That baby wouldn't make it an hour." "No, you'll stay here until it's safe. I won't hear any argument about it." He said it more firmly than he intended, and Sarah looked surprised, but also relieved. The baby was crying harder now, and Sarah looked down at her with such worry that Jacob felt his chest tighten again. "She's so hungry," Sarah whispered. "I haven't been able to feed her properly. I'm so weak myself." Jacob turned away, uncomfortable with the intimacy of the moment. "I have dried milk powder," he said. "From the trading post. And honey. We can mix something for her." Sarah's eyes widened. You have milk powder? Oh, Mr. Thornewood, that would be a blessing. Jacob set about preparing a bottle, something he had never done before in his life, working from half-remembered instructions from when his brother's wife had a baby years ago, before they both died and left him alone. Sarah watched him with gratitude so naked it made him uncomfortable, and when he finally handed her the bottle and watched the baby latch onto it with desperate hunger, he had to look away from the tears streaming down Sarah's face. Emma and Thomas woke soon after, and Jacob found himself making breakfast for four, a strange domestic scene that felt both foreign and oddly right. The children were quiet, watchful, clearly used to staying out of the way and not being a burden. It broke something in Jacob to see it, the way they asked for nothing, expected nothing, as if they had learned that the world was not a generous place. You can speak, you know, he said gruffly to Emma as she helped him set out plates. I'm not going to bite your head off. Emma looked up at him with those two old eyes. Mama says we should be quiet and grateful. That you're being very kind to let us stay. Your mama's right that I'm letting you stay, Jacob said. But you're children. Children aren't meant to be silent as stones. If you have something to say, you say it. Thomas, emboldened by this, piped up immediately. Are you a mountain man? Do you fight bears? Jacob felt the corner of his mouth twitch, almost a smile. I'm a woodsman. I cut down trees. And no, I don't fight bears. I do my best to avoid them entirely. Have you ever seen an Indian? Thomas asked, his eyes wide. Thomas, Sarah said sharply from the bed. Don't pester Mr. Thornewood with questions. It's fine, Jacob said, surprising himself. Yes, I've seen Indians. Lakota people pass through here sometimes. They've always left me be, and I've left them be. That's the way of things out here. The day passed slowly, the storm showing no mercy. Jacob found himself telling the children stories, things he hadn't thought about in years. Stories his own father had told him about the old country, about Ireland and the potato famine that had driven their family to America. Stories about his brother and the adventures they'd had as boys. Sarah listened too, nursing the baby, her color a bit better with food and rest, though Jacob could see she was still weak. In the afternoon, while the children napped, Sarah insisted on helping Jacob with small tasks around the cabin. She mended a tear in his shirt that had been there for months, patched a hole in his glove, and swept the floor despite his protests. I need to feel useful, she said quietly. I need to feel like less of a burden. You're not a burden, Jacob said, and was surprised to find he meant it. Yes, it was strange having people in his space, but it wasn't the intrusion he had feared. If anything, the cabin felt more alive than it had in years. That evening, with the children fed and settled by the fire, Sarah told Jacob her story. How she had married young, barely 16, to a man 10 years her senior who seemed kind enough. How they had struggled on a small farm in Kansas, barely scraping by, crop failures and bad luck following them year after year. How when her husband heard about the opportunities out west, he became convinced it was their salvation, their chance to finally make something of themselves. He wasn't a bad man, Sarah said softly, staring into the fire. Just unlucky. And perhaps not as strong as he thought he was. When he took sick on the trail, it happened so fast. One day he was driving the wagon, the next he was burning with fever. 2 days after that, he was gone. We buried him in the cold ground without even a proper marker, because we couldn't spare the time or the tools to make one. She wiped at her eyes. I don't even know if I can find the place again, to tell his children where their father rests. Jacob didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, just sat beside her and let her cry quietly into her hands. When she had composed herself, she looked at him with something like determination. My sister probably thinks we're dead by now. The letter I sent said we'd be there by late autumn. It's nearly Christmas. She'll have given up hope.
When the storm breaks, we'll get word to her, Jacob said. Copper Falls has a telegraph office. We'll wire ahead. Let her know you're safe and on your way. If we have any way left to get there, Sarah said bitterly. The wagon is broken. The oxen probably dead by now if they haven't been taken by wolves. We have nothing, Mr. Thornewood. Less than nothing. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, watching the fire, listening to the storm outside and the gentle breathing of the children. He thought about his life before they came, the emptiness of it, the way each day had been exactly like the last. He thought about how the cabin had felt alive these past 2 days, how strange it was to cook for more than himself, to hear laughter and questions and the sounds of family. We'll figure something out, he said finally. There's always a way forward, even when it doesn't seem like it. Sarah looked at him with such gratitude and such hope that Jacob felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had made a promise, even if he didn't quite know how he would keep it. But he would keep it. He had to dot the choice that changes everything. The storm finally broke on the 3rd day, leaving behind a world transformed into white silence. Snow lay 4 feet deep in places, glittering under a weak winter sun, and the temperature had dropped so low that Jacob could hear the trees cracking in the cold. He knew without checking that the road to Copper Falls would be impassable for at least a week, maybe longer. They were snowed in, trapped together in the small cabin, and Jacob found himself less troubled by that fact than he should have been. Sarah was stronger now, the color back in her cheeks, though she remained thin and moved carefully, as if afraid her strength might desert her at any moment. She had taken over the cooking, despite Jacob's protests, and he had to admit the cabin felt more like a home with the smell of fresh bread and stew bubbling on the stove. The children had lost some of their wariness, Thomas chattering constantly now that he knew Jacob wouldn't scold him for it, Emma helping her mother with quiet competence, and baby Lily filling out a bit with regular feeding, her cries growing stronger. Jacob found himself noticing things he hadn't noticed before. The way Sarah hummed while she worked, old songs that might have been hymns or folk tunes, he couldn't tell. The way Emma watched him with careful eyes whenever he picked up his axe, as if memorizing the movements so she could protect her family if needed. The way Thomas followed him around like a shadow whenever Jacob went out to split wood or check on the supplies, asking endless questions about everything he saw. It was on the 4th day that Thomas, bundled up in borrowed clothes too big for him, asked the question that had clearly been on his mind. Mr. Thornewood, do you think we could stay here? With you? Jacob nearly dropped the log he was carrying. What makes you ask that? Thomas shrugged, his small face serious. Mama cries at night. She tries to be quiet, but I hear her. She's scared about Oregon, about Aunt Martha, about what's going to happen to us. But here, she doesn't cry during the day anymore. She smiles sometimes. And Emma laughs when you tell stories. We never had that with Papa. He was always worried, always angry about something. Jacob set down the log and knelt in the snow, so he was eye level with the boy. Thomas, your mama has plans. She has family waiting for her. I'm just a stopover, a place to rest until the weather clears. But what if you didn't have to be? Thomas asked, his voice small but determined. What if you could be more than that?